Are we on the right track here?
Far be it from me to answer that question, but I will say, it's reasonable to ask whether or not this presents some sort of leak risk that could allow the Chinese to get a hold of the more advanced NVIDIA chips that NVIDIA is not allowed to sell into the Chinese market. These are definitely much closer to top tier chips than what China can buy. And, there's this awkward reality that China has built large parts of Saudi Arabia's digital and telecom infrastructure in order to strengthen its relationships in the Middle East. Now that stuff's going to be run, with U.S. chips according to U.S. rules, maybe. So that, that does potentially give China access, although there are a lot of controls in place on the U.S. side that are supposed to prevent that. But more importantly, it changes the strategic game for China vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. It potentially limits China's influence, and it complicates its strategy of making Saudi Arabia a long-term tech partner. It complicates China's plans for the digital Belt and Road.
Well, just to offer the counter argument, Anna, and of course you've been attuned to this, I'm sure, but the debate has really been heating up between the China national security hawks and the tech world. And what we hear often from the White House, particularly the likes of David Sachs, is that you can be a China national security hawk or an XYZ national security hawk and still embrace the tech side of it. Is there a way to thread the needle? Is there a way in this argument to assure that the tech can be transferred safely and securely and still benefit in all the ways that you would from tech prosperity while also guarding against the national security risk?
I mean, certainly that is the position of people like Jensen Huang, and it is also, absolutely the case that these very tech companies that give the United States its competitive edge in any tech competition with China, do need to be able to access bigger markets than just the U.S. and Europe. They need to be able to sell their chips abroad and lots of other places in order to have the funding to remain at the competitive edge, especially when we're talking about China's government bankrolling a lot of the efforts to catch up with U.S. tech advantages. And one of the biggest markets there is, of course, is China.
Well, Anna, I want to follow with something a little more China-focused, and given that's also your expertise in any case. Bloomberg was reporting last week that the U.S. and China have yet to agree on the sort of rare earth export controls lifting that was agreed between the two leaders. Where do you see that conversation going? Do you have any sense of whether or not there will be some sort of agreement to kind of free up the rare earths that the U.S. side so badly wants?
I mean, definitely we've had lots of signals that there is an agreement in the works. I mean, there have been announcements from Chinese government agencies and announcements from the U.S. government indicating that that's the track that the two countries are on. The question is, are the U.S. perceptions of what was agreed to the same as the Chinese perceptions of what was agreed to? In the past, it really mattered coming out of any U.S.-China talks whether or not there was a joint statement. And it mattered because of the fact that there often were differing perceptions about exactly what the two sides had signed up for. We don't often have any sort of written outcome document now, one from either side, let alone one that is a joint outcome document. So there certainly are questions there. And I think it's important to reiterate that even with the agreement in place and moving forward, regardless of whether it looks like something that Washington thinks it is or whatever Beijing thinks it is, it's not permanent. It is temporary, and it is not a total lifting of all restrictions. It's simply, a lessening of the hurdles for the U.S. To get access to certain of these materials.
Anna, what does Beijing think? What does President Xi think of this dance this week in Washington between President Trump and the Crown Prince?
I'm sure that it is not a surprise, because we've seen that Trump has courted the crown prince in the past, and he takes
Is
a
he
very
threatened
different
by
view.
this relationship?
I don't think that Xi Jinping is threatened by this relationship, but I do think that he has to be taking it seriously as potentially complicating his own relationship with Saudi Arabia. Absolutely.
Yeah, certainly a lot to explore there, and also the Russia component. That's one thing that we were bringing up yesterday in our conversations with guests about whether or not the tech transfer, particularly of F-35 military aircraft, could fall in the hands, or the wrong hands in any case, in the U.S.'s view. I mean, going back to what we were talking about previously, where do you see Russia kind of playing into this conversation at the moment?
Well, I mean, I imagine that there are both worries and reasons for optimism in Moscow as well as Beijing, because, on the one hand, I think that it's obvious that there is a desire to not see the U.S. cozy up to the crown prince and be able to facilitate a stronger U.S.-Saudi Arabia relationship. Both Russia and China have interests in keeping that relationship from being too close. On the other hand, the kinds of technology that the U.S. is offering to Saudi Arabia absolutely are of interest to both China and Russia, and Saudi Arabia may potentially provide an avenue for accessing those.
Anna, we talked earlier on the sidelines of Bloomberg's New Economy Forum in Singapore with John Waldron, President Chief Operating Officer at Goldman Sachs, who addressed the geopolitical risk here when it comes to the engagement of the U.S. and China. Listen to what he said.
I think that the dynamic between the U.S. and China, which we call increasing strategic interdependence. So the countries are interdependent, but there are going to be areas where they're going to be more focused on national security. And because that relationship is getting much more complicated, you're seeing more fragmentation around the world. And so a lot of the conversation here in Singapore this week has been about fragmentation, new regional alliances, redesigning supply chains. I worry about that because it's a new world order, and we don't really know what to expect in that new world order. And I think that will create disruption and pressure in the system, which is kind of unprecedented for the system that we've operated under for quite a long time.
So, Anna, where does the Middle East and where does Saudi Arabia fall in that new world order?
I think that Saudi Arabia and the Middle East are going to be important to a new world order, maybe not any more important than they are in the current world order. They're positioning themselves to sort of graduate from their traditional dependence on fossil fuels to run their economies and their economic growth to becoming tech hubs. And they've been doing so pretty successfully so far. So I do think that they're going to remain important. I also think that the thing that was said there that deserves a little extra attention is that the U.S. and China remain interdependent. Because yes, we do. But one of the things that that China's working very hard on is reducing that interdependence on its own side, just as we have been trying to reduce that interdependence. And, I think that there's a real question as to how fast that might happen. And, what will this new world order look like if there is less interdependence, especially on the tech front?